The weight of the oranges rolling across the hardwood floor echoed louder than my daughter's laugh. Still, I crouched down without a word, my hands steady as I gathered what she watched fall. As the citrus smell rose, bright, bitter, lingering, it mixed with the silence she left behind. While I knelt there, the cold wood pressing into my knee, I remembered every time I made her load lighter. The same daughter who laughed as I stumbled once cried for help she never earned. That's when I knew. If she could mock my hands, she could pay her own bills. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Joanne's arms ached with the weight of the groceries. 2 bags in each hand, plastic handles biting into her skin, but she didn't complain. She never did. The crisp Colorado air nipped at her cheeks as she trudged up the narrow, worn steps to her duplex. Every movement felt heavy, but she wasn't about to let it show. Not now. Not when the house was just a few feet away, and the last thing she wanted was help. She reached for the door, but it swung open too quickly. Her elbow caught the edge, and for a moment, the door refused to yield. She cursed softly under her breath, shifting the bags. The hinges groaned, and with one last push, the door flung open just wide enough for her to slip inside. The warm, familiar smell of the house hit her like a wave. Clean linens, freshly brewed coffee, the faint trace of lavender from the soap she used to wash the kitchen counter. Tessa was on the couch, eyes glued to her phone. She didn't even look up. "You need help, or are you proving a point again?" she said, her voice as indifferent as the flick of her fingers scrolling across the screen. Joanne's fingers tightened around the plastic handles, her teeth pressing together. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she shifted her weight, carefully stepping into the hallway. She wasn't going to ask. She didn't want help. Not now. Not from Tessa. She took another step, and that's when it happened. The floor beneath her seemed to tilt, the weight of the bags too much to carry, too much to balance. Her foot caught on the rug that she'd never quite managed to get straight. A bag slipped from her hand. She didn't have time to catch it. Oranges rolled out, bouncing like marbles across the hardwood floor, their bright orange skins shining under the muted light of the overhead bulb. A quiet, sharp curse slipped from her lips, but the damage was done. Tessa's head lifted from her phone, her lips curling into a smirk. She didn't even stand up. "Told you," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Joanne froze. She stood there, the echo of the sound of oranges rolling across the floor drowning out everything else. She didn't reach down. Not yet. She didn't pick them up. Not yet. Instead, she simply stood there, watching the fruit as it came to a slow stop. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of a distant car passing by outside. Everything in the house felt still, but inside her, something shifted. She heard the door creak open behind her, a sudden gust of air. And then Ryan's voice, louder, more genuine than Tessa's. "Grandma, let me help." Ryan, with his messy brown hair and his soft eyes, stepped into the hallway. His expression was strained, tight, furious. He crouched down, his hands reaching for the scattered fruit. Joanne could see the clenched fists at his sides, the way his jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Tessa be dismissive of her, but this time, it felt different. Joanne said nothing as Ryan stood back up, oranges in his hands. He met her gaze, and for a brief moment there was an unspoken understanding. No words were needed. He knew why she hadn't said anything. "Mom should have helped," Ryan muttered, but Joanne didn't answer him. Tessa was already back on her phone, dismissive again. But for the first time in a long while, Joanne didn't care. The silence that followed was deafening. The bags, still half full, rested at her feet, their contents unnoticed. Ryan stayed close, a quiet presence in the background as she bent down and picked them up. One by one. Her back protested with every movement, but she didn't let it show. Tessa's laugh broke the silence again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even harsh. But it still stung. Joanne's hands tightened around the bags. She swallowed hard, the frustration rising like a storm in her chest. She'd been carrying the weight of her family's life for so long. Too long. And today was the day it all started to shift. She turned to Ryan, not looking back at Tessa, and said, "Get the door, please." Ryan hesitated for a moment, then did as she asked. As he opened the door, the wind blew in, crisp and cold. The house, warm with the scent of old wood and fresh groceries, felt a little emptier somehow, a little quieter. As she walked past him, one bag in each hand, she glanced out into the cold, but instead of feeling the sharp sting of the air, she felt a quiet resolve settle in. Tessa didn't get it, but she would. And soon she'd understand the weight of what she had said, and what she had taken for granted, for far too long. The kitchen table was scattered with the month's bills, their edges curling slightly from age, some edges torn where the bills had been shoved aside in the past. Joanne didn't mind. She wasn't in the mood to organize them neatly tonight. She had a different task in mind. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she smoothed out the papers. The weight of those small routine numbers had carried so much more for so long. Utilities, rent, the insurance, all of it. Her name at the top. Every penny that kept Tessa's world running without question. Every single bill that came from the unit Tessa lived in. It had always been like this. Joanne shouldered the burden without a word. But today, that was about to change. Joanne's fingers moved instinctively over the pile, separating the electric, water, and cable bills. Her steady eyes scanning for what she knew was there. For what she hadn't noticed until recently. How many bills did Tessa's life actually cost? Too many. The fact that they were all auto-debited under her name now seemed so obvious, it made her stomach clench. She'd paid them all, quietly, without a second thought. Tessa had always been busy, dismissive, too focused on herself to notice, or perhaps too proud to care. As Joanne reached for the final bill, the phone on the counter buzzed. She stared at the screen for a moment, recognizing Mira's name. She pressed open, reading the text as it appeared. "You ever move forward with those account transfers?" The words felt like a quiet affirmation. "You're not crazy for doing this. You're not cruel. You're justified." Joanne's fingers were steady as she typed back, her response simple but firm. "I'm ready now." Her breath was steady as she set the phone down, her resolve solidifying like a stone settling in her chest. She wasn't just thinking anymore. She was doing. She grabbed a blank notepad, its surface pristine, untouched. The clean white space in front of her felt oddly comforting, almost like a fresh start, a way to regain control of what had always been lost. The lines of her handwriting were firm but with an edge, intentional. She wrote slowly, methodically, as if the very act of writing it down would make it real. "Transfer all bills to Tessa." She paused. The words hung in the air between her and the page, heavy, almost suffocating. There was no turning back. Not after this. Not after she'd seen it all laid bare. Tessa would understand soon enough, if she hadn't already begun to feel the shift in the air. Joanne set the pen down and her eyes drifted over to the kitchen window. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the faintest glow of dusk. The house was quiet, too quiet. For a moment she considered how long it had been since she truly felt like herself, like her decisions mattered. A knock at the door broke the silence. Joanne's thoughts snapped back, and she was already on her feet before the second knock came. It was Ryan. He stepped into the kitchen, looking hesitant but determined, His expression softened as he looked at her, almost as if he were unsure of what to say. "Sorry about earlier," Ryan muttered, his eyes avoiding hers for a moment, then meeting her gaze with a quiet intensity. There was no anger in his voice now, just a mix of understanding and frustration. Joanne studied him for a beat, a flicker of something passing through her. Guilt? Sympathy? Maybe a touch of both. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the paper she had written on, the words still bold and resolute. "You know," Ryan began again, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "You don't have to do this." Joanne exhaled a slow, controlled breath. "I don't," she said, her voice quieter than she'd intended. She met his gaze then, finally, and her lips curled slightly in a gesture that almost seemed like a smile. "But I will." Ryan's gaze softened, but his brows furrowed. "You're not just trying to make Mom suffer, are you?" Joanne's gaze flickered, her chest tightening at the thought. "No, this is about responsibility, about showing her the weight of what she's taken for granted." Ryan stood in the doorway watching her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if on cue, the wind howled through the cracks in the old windows, a cold draft sweeping across the room. Joanne was already moving again, her hands gathering up the bills, ready to call Mira, ready to make the first move. But as she picked up the phone, Ryan lingered. "I'll be here for you, Grandma," he said quietly. "I just hope you're ready for whatever happens next." Joanne didn't answer right away. Her fingers lingered over the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then, without a word, she dialed the number, the call ringing in her ear. She looked at Ryan once more, meeting his gaze with a strength that felt like something old, something buried, coming back to life. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." And with that, the phone call went through. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Joanne stepped into the utility office, the cold air from outside still clinging to her coat. She glanced around briefly, nothing but the usual sterile setup. Long desks, stacked papers, and a queue of customers with their own small crises. She stood at the counter for a moment, her gaze flicking to the receptionist, who looked up and gave a tired smile. "I'm here to update an account," Joanne said, her voice steady, betraying none of the tension that wound through her chest. The clerk, a young woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, nodded and motioned for her to sit. Joanne didn't sit. Instead, she took a deep breath, her fingers curling into a fist for just a moment before relaxing. Her mind was clear, every step in her plan mapped out as though she were walking a tightrope, steady and purposeful. The clerk handed her a few forms and a pen. "We'll need you to fill these out for the transfer of responsibility." Joanne took the forms without hesitation, her pen moving smoothly across the paper as she filled in Tessa's name. The words felt final, almost permanent. Each letter she wrote seemed to echo in the quiet of the office. It was happening. She was making it happen. Tessa was about to see just how heavy the weight of responsibility truly was. As she completed the paperwork, the clerk returned with a man in a navy uniform, obviously the manager. He nodded at Joanne, then quickly scanned the papers. "I see you're transferring the billing responsibility to your daughter," he said, flipping through the pages with the kind of practiced indifference only someone in customer service for too long could have. "Yes," Joanne replied, her voice calm, almost flat. "It's all in order, I believe." The clerk nodded, making a note on her computer. Joanne could see her fingers typing rapidly, processing everything in real time, ensuring that all the correct codes were entered. It would be effective starting the next cycle, just as she'd asked. As she glanced around the room, the dull hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, like the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She wasn't angry, not anymore. There was just a cold clarity that had taken hold of her. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to fight. She just needed to act. The clerk finished entering everything into the system and turned back to Joanne. All set. The responsibility for both the electric and water accounts is now under your daughter's name. This will take effect starting next month. Joanne's hands didn't shake as she signed the final document. Exactly, she said, her tone still controlled, yet there was something hard in it now. Something more than just finality. She could feel it settling into the marrow of her bones. The clerk handed her a receipt, her expression unreadable as she slid it across the counter. Joanne took it without another word, the receipt warm in her hands, a reminder of what she had just done. She turned toward the door, but before she could make it out, the phone in her pocket buzzed again. Mira's name flashed on the screen, and Joanne couldn't help but feel a spark of something deep inside her. The plan was in motion, and she had no intentions of stopping now. She stepped outside the building, the cold air immediately biting at her face, but it didn't matter. She was steady now. She was doing this. The phone buzzed again, and she answered without hesitation. Done, she said simply, not needing to say more. Mira's voice on the other end was like a cold wind, brisk and to the point. Want me to prep the lease revocation next? Mira asked, the question sharp, but more like a confirmation than a suggestion. Joanne's steps faltered for a moment. Her chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. Yes, she replied, a single word filled with everything she felt, all the emotions she had carefully kept locked away. The line clicked as Mira ended the call. Joanne stood still in the parking lot for a moment, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The city felt like it was holding its breath. Her hands tightened around the phone, her grip firm but not shaking. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. But the next step was even bigger than this one. The thought made her pulse quicken for a fraction of a second, then settle back into the quiet determination she had learned to cultivate over the years. She was doing what needed to be done. She was taking back control of what had been quietly taken from her for far too long, and soon, Tessa would understand the weight of all the things she'd ignored, of all the things Joanne had carried for her. Soon, Tessa would learn what it meant to stand alone. With a final glance at the office building, Joanne made her way back to her car, her steps steady, her resolve even stronger than before. The end was just beginning. The letter sat on the kitchen counter, bold and glaring. Its white surface seemed to demand attention, an imposing reminder of what was now Tessa's responsibility. The words on the envelope read like a simple notification, but to Joanne, it was something else entirely, a symbol of the shift that had already begun. She had been waiting for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she could feel the anticipation in her chest, a strange mix of satisfaction and a quiet, simmering excitement. Tessa's voice cut through the stillness of the house before she even fully entered the kitchen. Mom, what the hell is this? The anger was immediate, almost instinctive, and it made Joanne's heart beat a little faster. Tessa stood in the doorway, the bill in her hand, her expression twisted in confusion and disbelief. Why is this in my name? What happened to the autopay? You didn't change something, did you? Joanne didn't look up from the stack of papers she was sorting through. She could feel Tessa's eyes burning into her, the tension in the room palpable. Tessa's footsteps were heavy, like a child angry at being caught doing something wrong. Joanne's fingers remained steady as they flipped the pages. Check your mail, Joanne said, her tone even, unbothered. Tessa's eyes narrowed as she stalked forward, slamming the bill on the counter in front of her mother. The figure at the top, the full amount, no deductions, no autopay, was enough to make anyone flinch. What kind of passive-aggressive stunt is this? Tessa sneered, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. You could have told me about this before just pulling this crap. Her hand hovered over the bill, as if she could will the words to change with sheer force of will. Joanne didn't flinch. She'd seen this before. Seeing Tessa's deflection, her need to lash out when something didn't go her way, the bitter resentment that lingered just beneath the surface. But Joanne was calm now, more centered than she'd been in years. "No," Joanne replied quietly, her gaze still fixed on her papers. "Just a shift in responsibility." The words, though simple, held weight. Tessa's eyes flared, her mouth opening as though she was about to explode. But instead, she stopped herself. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until Ryan's voice broke it, soft but cutting. "You deserve this," he whispered, loud enough for both of them to hear. His tone wasn't angry, wasn't harsh, just matter of fact. His eyes met his mother's for a brief moment, his expression steady, almost relieved. Tessa whipped her head around, fury flashing in her eyes as she locked onto him. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice rising in a shrill pitch. Ryan didn't back down. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and stared back at her without blinking. "You heard me," he said, his voice steady. Yet, there was something in his eyes, an understanding that Tessa would never have. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't trying to hurt her. But he could see what his mother had been carrying for years. And now it was her turn to feel it. Joanne finally looked up from her papers. There was a quiet sense of peace in her now, almost like a weight lifting from her shoulders, though Tessa could never understand it. Not yet, but she would. Tessa's face twisted with disbelief. Her lips parted as if searching for words that would make sense of what had just happened. Instead, she slammed the bill back onto the counter with enough force to rattle the entire stack of papers Joanne had been sorting. "This is ridiculous," Tessa muttered, stepping back from the counter as if she were about to walk out. But then she paused, her eyes narrowing with a new kind of defiance. "You can't just expect me to—" "You'll have to," Joanne interrupted, her voice still calm, but now there was something more behind it. A firmness. "This is how it works now. Your responsibility. Your bills." Tessa took a step back, her jaw clenched as she tried to come to grips with the shift in the air. Joanne didn't even seem angry anymore, just calm. Almost like she'd been preparing for this moment for a long time. Tessa's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned away, the sound of her footsteps heavy as she left the room. But before the door fully closed behind her, Ryan spoke again, his voice quiet but with an edge of something Joanne hadn't heard in years. "Don't let her fool you, Grandma," he said, his gaze flickering toward the door where Tessa had just exited. "She'll be back, but she'll know. It's not going to be the same anymore." Joanne let out a slow breath, the weight of everything in her chest lighter now. She didn't need to explain herself to Tessa. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed again, Mira's name flashing across the screen. Joanne didn't hesitate as she picked it up. "It's done," she said, the words carrying the weight of finality. "You sure?" Mira's voice crackled through the speaker, cold but reassuring. "I'm sure." The next step was coming. And this time, Tessa wouldn't be able to ignore it. The office smelled of old leather and fresh coffee. Mira sat behind her desk, papers spread out in neat stacks. Everything was in order, just as it always had been. But today, there was a difference. Joanne could feel it in the air. In the way Mira's eyes flicked up at her from the papers with an unspoken understanding. Joanne sat across from her, her hands folded neatly on the table. She could already feel the weight of the decision she was about to make. It had taken years to come to this point, years of quiet sacrifice, of bearing the load without ever complaining. But today, things would change. Mira pushed the title deed across the table, a simple piece of paper that would mean everything. The words on it were just letters, but they carried all the finality Joanne had been searching for. "I've updated the deed to reflect the changes," Mira said, her voice smooth but firm. She didn't need to say much. The details were already understood. It's now under the trust, with Ryan as the successor beneficiary. Tessa's name has been removed from any future inheritance. Joanne picked up the document, her fingers brushing the edges as she scanned the lines of text. There it was, plain and clear. Ryan's name where Tessa's had once been. The future she had dreamed of for him, and the one she knew Tessa could never fully appreciate. Tessa won't see it coming, Joanne muttered under her breath. Though the words weren't meant for Mira, they were just a thought that had escaped her lips. She set the deed down, and her eyes hardened. She has no claim now. Mira nodded, her expression unreadable but satisfied. Locked. This is final. No one can change it now. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with a sense of calm that matched Joanne's own. Joanne's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was a smile of resolution. It had been a long time since she felt like this, steady, sure, ready for whatever came next. Good, Joanne said, her voice low but solid. She reached for the pen that Mira had set out for her, and, with deliberate care, signed the document. Now let's see how she does without the free ride. Mira's lips twitched into something like a smile, though she quickly masked it behind a veil of professionalism. You've done the right thing. Tessa will learn. Eventually. Joanne's gaze never left the deed. She had spent so many years keeping things together, making sure Tessa's life remained comfortable, that now she found herself almost curious. Would Tessa realize the cost of her own neglect? Would she understand what it meant to be held up for so long before finally being left to stand on her own? As she sat back, Joanne felt an odd sense of calm. For the first time in years, she wasn't scrambling to fix everything. She was letting the world right itself, letting Tessa see the weight of the choices she had made. Outside, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the floor. It was a perfect moment of stillness, one that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. Joanne's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, recognizing Ryan's name. Her hand paused in midair, and for a moment, she debated whether or not to pick it up. But she knew. Ryan had already seen the changes, had already been a part of this shift, whether or not he realized the full scope of it. She answered the call, bringing the phone to her ear. Hi, Ryan. Grandma, he said, his voice a little hesitant. But there was something different in the way he said it. There's a new lockbox on your desk. What's that for? Joanne glanced to her left, where the small metal box sat next to the stack of papers. It hadn't been there this morning. She hadn't told Ryan about it, hadn't even had the chance to mention it. The deed, Joanne said simply, her eyes flicking to Mira, who was now watching her with interest. The property is secured, Ryan. I wanted to make sure it stays in the right hands. Right hands, Ryan repeated, his tone a little confused. Then, after a beat, he added, So, Tessa can't touch it anymore? No, Joanne replied, her voice firm. Not unless she earns it. Ryan didn't respond right away, and for a long moment there was nothing but the faint hum of the office air conditioning and the weight of the silence between them. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. I don't think she'll ever understand, Grandma. Joanne's heart tightened at the thought. She wanted to say something to make Ryan feel like everything was going to be okay, but she didn't need to. He already knew. Maybe not, she said softly, but I'm not doing this for her anymore. I'm doing it for you. Ryan's voice, quieter now, held a note of something deeper. I know. Thanks, Grandma. Joanne hung up the phone, placing it on the desk beside her. She met Mira's gaze across the table, both of them fully aware of the weight of the moment. The deed was done. The world was set into motion. Tessa would come to terms with it, or she wouldn't. Either way, the path had been laid, and Joanne, for the first time in what felt like forever, had nothing more to prove. She was done carrying the weight alone. The future, it seemed, was already here. The day was unremarkable at first. Just another quiet morning in the house that Joanne had once filled with the noise of daily life. But as the clock ticked past noon, a quiet shift occurred. Joanne noticed the silence was more profound than usual. She hadn't heard Tessa in hours. Then the phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she picked it up anyway, already knowing who was calling. "Hello, Mrs. Baxter?" The voice on the other end was polite but businesslike, the type of tone reserved for those who had been dealing with late payments for far too long. "We've noticed a missed payment for your utility bill this month. Is there an issue we should be aware of?" Joanne held the receiver to her ear, her hand steady as the words formed in her mind. "This is the first step." She said nothing, but a faint smile played at the corner of her lips. The voice continued, trying to mask the frustration in their tone. "We'd like to remind you that a late fee of $35 has been added to your balance. If this is an oversight, please let us know immediately." She didn't respond. Instead, she set the phone down with deliberate care, the soft click of the receiver the only sound in the room. It wasn't long before the first of many late fees arrived, printed neatly in bold, unmistakable font. The bill was more than just a late payment. It was the beginning of Tessa's reckoning. Joanne knew exactly what would follow. She knew how Tessa would respond, how her frustration would bubble over into something loud, messy, and public. Joanne had been preparing for this moment, the moment when Tessa would have to face the consequences of the world that Joanne had held together for so long. That evening, the first post appeared on Facebook. "Why are older parents so spiteful?" Tessa's words, sharp and accusatory, cut through the digital world like a knife. "I've been paying my own way since I was 20, but some people can't let go of their control." Joanne didn't flinch. She didn't even feel the sting of Tessa's words anymore. She simply sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, her eyes flicking across the post. She'd been expecting it. The online outbursts, the deflection, the need to play the victim. Tessa never could own her actions. But Joanne could see it. How Tessa was struggling to justify what she hadn't done. How she tried to make the world believe that she was a victim when, in truth, the world had given her every opportunity, every ounce of support, and she had squandered it. The doorbell rang, and Joanne rose from her seat with slow deliberation. She didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Tessa stood on the other side, the sound of her fists pounding against the door not even enough to rattle Joanne. Joanne opened the door. Tessa's eyes were wide, frantic, the anger on her face only partially masked by the confusion of the situation. She thrust the utility bill in Joanne's face. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tessa demanded, her voice rising with every word. "This is your fault. You always do this. You think you can control everything, but you can't." Joanne stared at her without saying a word. Her gaze was steady, her face unreadable. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. She had no need to explain, no need to justify. The weight had already shifted. Tessa waved the bill like it was some weapon, like the numbers on the page were a personal affront. "I'm not paying this. This is your mess to clean up." Joanne didn't blink. "Check your bank account." Tessa froze, her face contorting with confusion. "What do you mean?" "The payment was never my responsibility," Joanne said, her voice calm, unyielding. "The bills are yours now, Tessa. You wanted this freedom. You wanted control." Tessa's face reddened, her lips trembling as she tried to form words that weren't coming fast enough. You did this on purpose. You're trying to punish me." Joanne shook her head slightly, her expression softening only just enough to show that she felt the weight of this moment too, though she would never say it aloud. "No. You're doing this to yourself. I'm just letting you see the cost of your choices. Tessa took a step back, the anger seeping into her body like poison. I'm going to tell everyone what you did. You're cruel. Joanne watched as Tessa turned and stormed away, her retreating figure a picture of defiance. But Joanne could see the cracks, the small tremors in Tessa's bravado. She could hear the soft tremble in Tessa's voice, the unspoken question that hung between them. What happens now? Joanne stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her daughter disappear into the night, already knowing the answer. Later that evening, Mira's name appeared on Joanne's phone screen. Without hesitation, Joanne answered. Want to respond to her post? Mira asked, her voice sharp but with a hint of humor. Joanne's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was devoid of any real amusement. No. I prefer her creditors do the talking. The line went quiet for a moment, and then Mira's voice came through, a little warmer than before. You've made your point. Joanne looked out the window, the city lights flickering like stars against the dark sky. No, the point's just beginning. Tessa would have to face it, the long road that had been set out before her, one step at a time, and Joanne, for the first time in years, could finally breathe. The first thing Joanne did the morning after the confrontation was reach for her checkbook, the same one that had sat in the drawer for years. Her fingers traced the smooth cover for a moment before she pulled it out, flipping it open and reaching for the nearest pen. With a sharp motion, she crossed out the name that had been there for far too long, Tessa Baxter. She didn't pause as she filled in the line next to it. Just a few simple words that would change everything. Remove cosigner status. Her hand shook for only a moment, but it was the last tremor of hesitation. When it was done, the weight that had been on her shoulders for so long finally began to lift. It wasn't just a financial decision. It was the final severing of ties. It was the moment when she stopped carrying Tessa's weight, stopped saving her from the consequences of her own mistakes. Joanne stood up from the desk, her gaze never leaving the note she'd just written. The air in the room felt different now, charged, almost, as though the world had tilted slightly, and she was no longer bound by the unspoken promises that had kept her tethered to Tessa's needs. She dialed Mira's number, her fingers tapping the table as she waited for the call to connect. Mira's voice came through quickly, sharp but familiar. You've done it? Mira asked. Though it wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. Done, Joanne said simply, her voice steady but with a quiet undercurrent of satisfaction. No more cosigner, no more shared accounts. Everything's been transferred. The emergency fund is closed. Mira paused, a beat of silence on the other end. All the paperwork is in order then? She asked, her voice softening slightly, the concern still there but laced with pride. Joanne nodded, even though Mira couldn't see her. Yes, I've got the legal proof. Everything's set. The phone clicked lightly as Mira processed the news. Tessa won't see this coming, Joanne, she said finally, the words heavy with meaning. It's final now. No turning back. Joanne sat down at the kitchen table, pushing the paperwork aside and pulling out her old bank statements. She knew it wasn't over yet. Tessa wouldn't just accept it. Not easily. But she'd have to. Joanne wasn't going to bail her out anymore. And it felt damn good. Later that afternoon, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Joanne sat by the window, watching the world turn dark. The house was still, the way it had been for the past few weeks. There was something soothing about the silence now. Something freeing. Tessa had always been the loud force in their home, but now the stillness was a balm. The phone buzzed on the counter. Joanne glanced at it, recognizing Tessa's name. A moment of irritation flared up, but she squashed it down quickly. She wasn't going to be baited anymore. Instead, she stood, walked over to the drawer, and pulled out the small metal box that contained the old documents, everything that had tied them together. With deliberate care, She took the stack of papers, the old bank statements, the account transfers, and slid them into the shredder. The sound of the blades chewing through the paper was strangely satisfying. She watched as the documents fell into the bin, bits and pieces of a life that no longer belonged to her. There was no more need to hang on, no more need to protect. Ryan walked into the room, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. He looked at the shredder, then at his grandmother, who had the faintest of smiles on her face. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual, but with an edge of something Joanne hadn't quite expected. Joanne paused, her hand resting on the shredder for just a moment longer. "It does," she said, meeting Ryan's gaze with a steady look of her own. "It feels like I'm finally doing what's right." Ryan moved closer, his eyes flicking between the shredded paper and his grandmother's face. "She'll come for you again," he said, his voice hesitant but sure. "She always does. She'll blame you. Maybe even more now." Joanne set the pile of shredded paper into the bin, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "She can blame me all she wants, but she won't get what she needs from me anymore. Not unless she learns how to stand on her own." Ryan watched her for a long moment, something almost proud flickering in his eyes. "You did the right thing, Grandma." Joanne exhaled slowly, looking out the window. The house felt lighter now, like it had taken a deep breath. "Let's see if she can stand on her own," Joanne murmured, more to herself than to Ryan. The moment was quiet, but the weight of it hung in the air, heavier than anything she had felt in years. Tessa's world was about to unravel, and Joanne, for the first time, was done picking up the pieces. The question wasn't whether Tessa would learn. The question was whether she would finally be able to stand up on her own when everything else fell apart. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, its persistent ringing cutting through the stillness of the house. Joanne hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She knew who it was before she even picked it up. It had been a few days since the last confrontation, since the bills had piled up, since Tessa had stormed off in a fury, and since Joanne had finally drawn the line, but she could feel it coming. The call was inevitable. Tessa wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Joanne took a slow breath, set her cup down, and answered the phone with a calmness that surprised even her. "Mom, you're sabotaging me." Tessa's voice came through, sharp and accusing, laced with the bitterness Joanne had come to expect. "This is your mess, and you're making it mine. Why are you doing this to me?" Joanne closed her eyes for a moment, the words hanging in the air like smoke. She wasn't surprised by Tessa's response, but the sting of it still hit deep. This was her pattern. Whenever things got tough, Tessa turned to blaming, never once considering the weight of her own choices. "I'm not sabotaging you," Joanne said quietly, her voice unshaken. "I just stopped carrying you." There was a beat of silence on the other end, and for a moment Joanne thought maybe Tessa would hear the truth in her words. But the silence didn't last long. The frustration on Tessa's side only grew, boiling over. "You don't understand," Tessa snapped, her voice rising. "I have kids. I'm working. I can't do this alone. You're making everything worse." Joanne's grip tightened on the phone, but her tone remained steady. She'd heard it all before, the excuses, the justifications, the constant playing of the victim. Joanne let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "So was I, Tessa," she said, her words measured but firm. "So was I when I paid your bills." Tessa didn't answer immediately. Joanne could hear the breath in her daughter's voice, the wild anger cracking under the pressure of something deeper, something she didn't want to face. "I was working, raising you, keeping everything together. And all the while you didn't even notice. You took it for granted." There was a flicker of something in Tessa's silence, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. "You don't know what it's like to struggle," Tessa finally spat, her voice full of venom. "You don't know how hard it is to raise kids and deal with everything." Joanne shook her head, a quiet exhale escaping her lips. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to struggle now. But I sure as hell know what it's like to struggle while making sure you never had to." The words hung in the air, heavier than she'd meant them to be, but they were true. They were always true. Tessa was still silent on the other end, and Joanne felt the weight of those silences like a tidal wave. Tessa didn't want to hear the truth. She wanted someone to blame, and for so long, that had been Joanne, but not anymore. "I'm done," Joanne said softly, the finality in her voice undeniable. "You can't keep expecting me to be your safety net. I'm not doing it anymore." There was a long, strained pause. Then Tessa's voice came through, cold and brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Fine," she spat, and Joanne could hear the sting of betrayal in her words. "You want to abandon me? Fine. But don't expect me to ever forgive you." Joanne's chest tightened for just a moment, but she didn't let it show. She didn't need Tessa's forgiveness anymore. Not when it meant carrying the weight of her mistakes alone. "I'll do what I need to do," Joanne said quietly, "and so will you." The line went dead. Joanne set the phone down slowly, as if the weight of the conversation still clung to her hand. She could feel the anger in her chest, the heat of it rising up. But it wasn't her anger. It was Tessa's. And for the first time, Joanne didn't feel the need to carry it. As the quiet of the house returned, the air shifted again. Joanne felt the absence of Tessa's storm, the absence of the constant pressure to fix everything, to make things better, to somehow carry the burden of a life that wasn't her own to hold. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. It was getting late, the sky darkening to a rich blue, the first stars beginning to show. But something had changed. She could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to breathe more easily. Joanne's phone buzzed again, but this time, she didn't check it. She didn't need to. Her path was clear now, and nothing Tessa said or did would change that. Mira's number popped up on the screen a moment later. Joanne glanced at it, but this time, there was no hesitation. She answered. "Want to move up the eviction clause?" Mira's voice asked, knowing that the storm was far from over. Joanne's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes," she replied, the weight of the decision hanging in the air, but with a sense of finality. "Let's move it up." And with that, the next step began. The envelope sat on Joanne's desk, its weight suddenly so heavy she could feel it in her bones. It was the final step. The line had been drawn, the boundaries set. There was no turning back now. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her hands, the sharp edges of the paper digging into her palm. It had taken days to build up the courage to get here, to press, send on this letter that would forever change her relationship with Tessa. But it was done. With a steady hand, Joanne sealed the envelope, affixing the address label and the required postage. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just after noon. She could already hear the faint hum of the world moving on outside, people working, living, going about their day. But inside her home, everything felt suspended, like a tightrope stretched too thin. She was ready for whatever was next, but the weight of it still hung in the air. Joanne picked up the phone and dialed Leo, the property manager who had been with her through so many decisions over the years. His deep, gravelly voice answered almost immediately. "Joanne," he said, sounding tired but professional. "What can I do for you today?" "I need you to prepare the formal lockout," Joanne said, her voice calm, almost detached. "The notice is going out today." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Joanne knew what he was thinking. The lockout was the final measure, the last step in what had become an unavoidable, inevitable process. But it wasn't a decision she made lightly. "Understood," Leo replied quietly, I'll have everything ready. We'll move forward as soon as it's official. Joanne set the phone down, staring at the stack of papers on her desk, the lease termination notice now officially part of the pile. She had given Tessa every chance, every opportunity to take responsibility. Now, the consequences were hers to face. Later that afternoon, Tessa's voice echoed through the house before the door even opened. Joanne could hear it, her daughter's shrill tone, unmistakable even from a distance. The moment had arrived. Tessa stormed through the door, eyes wide with rage, holding the official notice in her hand like it was some sort of betrayal. Her lips were quivering, her words tripping over one another. "What the hell is this?" Tessa screamed, waving the paper in front of her mother's face. "You're kicking me out?" Joanne remained standing, her posture still, almost calm. The sight of her daughter's fury, the pleading look in her eyes, didn't move her anymore. She had seen it all before: the tantrums, the blame, the relentless guilt trips. But not anymore. Tessa had crossed a line, and this time it was Joanne who held the power. "Mom, you can't do this," Tessa cried, her voice cracking. "I'm not prepared for this. I have kids. How am I supposed to do this with them?" Joanne looked at her daughter, her gaze unwavering. "You're always welcome, Tessa, but you're not entitled to my support anymore." The words were hard, but they were the truth. Joanne had been carrying the weight of Tessa's life for far too long, and she was done. Tessa's face turned bright red, her body trembling with the force of her anger. "This isn't fair," she spat, the words venomous. "I've been trying. I've been working so hard, and you're just throwing me out like I'm nothing." Joanne stood firm, her hands clasped in front of her, her voice low but steady. "You've had your chances, Tessa, and now you'll have to do what you've refused to do for years. Stand on your own. If you can laugh at me while I carry your burdens, you can land on your feet without my help." Tessa opened her mouth to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for any excuse, any way out. But there was none. Joanne was done. Later that evening, after Tessa had stormed out again, Ryan came to Joanne's side. His steps were measured, the look in his eyes a mix of concern and understanding. He had watched this unfold from the sidelines, feeling the tension shift between them, but he never said a word. Now he stood beside her, the quiet between them more telling than any words could be. "She warned you," Ryan said softly, his eyes flickering toward the now empty doorway. "She's always been like this." Joanne nodded, her gaze focused on the papers on the table, her hands steady. "I've always tried to fix things for her, but I'm not doing it anymore." Ryan's eyes softened. "You did the right thing, Grandma," he said, a quiet pride in his voice. Joanne's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was tinged with sorrow. "We all have to let go at some point, Ryan. I've carried her for long enough." As the door slammed shut once again, the weight of the world seemed to settle on Joanne's shoulders. Tessa was gone. For now. Joanne was ready for the next step. Ready for whatever was coming next. The storm wasn't over. But for the first time, she wasn't the one left standing in its wake. She was the one finally moving forward. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each passing second hammering the moment closer. Joanne sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The house was quieter than it had been in weeks, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She glanced at the calendar on the wall, noting the date in bold, the day she'd marked as the final deadline. It was here. Her eyes flickered to the stack of papers on the table. Copies of the lease termination, the lockout notice, the official eviction documentation. She'd done everything by the book. Tessa had been warned. She had been given every opportunity to change, to act, to take responsibility. And now, the time had come. Joanne could hear the faint sounds of movement upstairs. The house was still, But she knew that Tessa had spent the night trying to ignore the inevitable. She hadn't packed, not even close. The mess in the living room and the unopened boxes she'd left in the hallway were evidence enough. Tessa had held on to the hope that something would change, that her mother would relent. But Joanne's resolve had solidified long ago. The front door opened with a quiet creak, and Joanne stood slowly, her back straight. The weight of the moment settled into her bones like an old, familiar ache. She could hear Tessa's footsteps before she saw her. Her daughter entered, eyes wide, the shock still evident on her face, though tinged with something else now. Defeat, maybe. Her bags were nowhere to be seen. "You didn't pack," Joanne said quietly, watching Tessa's reaction carefully. Tessa's eyes flickered to the pile of boxes, but the anger came first. It always did. "I'm not leaving," she snapped, her voice shaky but defiant. "You can't make me do this." Joanne's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unchanged. "You've had more than enough time. The deadline is today. You knew this day was coming." Tessa took a step forward, her voice rising with frustration. "You're doing this to punish me. You want to watch me fail." Joanne shook her head slowly. "I'm doing this because you need to stand on your own. This is what happens when you ignore your responsibilities, Tessa. I've carried you long enough. It's time you learned how to carry yourself." Tessa's face twisted with fury. "I can't believe you're doing this. After everything I've been through. After everything I've done for you." Her voice broke, but the anger never left. It just shifted, twisting into something deeper, more desperate. "You're not my mother anymore. You're just cruel." Joanne's gaze softened for just a fraction of a second, but she said nothing. Tessa needed to feel the weight of her own choices now. Joanne had spent too many years protecting her, making excuses for her. Not anymore. The front door opened again, and Leo, the property manager, stepped in. He glanced at Joanne, then to Tessa, his face neutral. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. Joanne had given the go-ahead. He already knew what to do. "Tessa," Leo said, his voice deep and level. "It's time." Tessa's eyes flicked to him, and then back to Joanne, a look of disbelief crossing her face. "You're actually having me thrown out?" Joanne didn't flinch. "I'm not throwing you out. You've had every opportunity to do this on your own. The choice was always yours." Leo stepped to the side as the sheriff's deputy entered behind him. The deputy was a tall, sturdy man, his presence almost imposing, though he wasn't here to cause trouble. He was here to ensure that things went smoothly, that Tessa's departure didn't escalate into anything more. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. She looked between Leo, the sheriff's deputy, and Joanne, the final realization dawning on her. The wall she had been banging against was real. There was no escape this time. She stepped forward again, her voice a mix of disbelief and desperation. "You can't just—" "I already did," Joanne said quietly, her voice steady. "This is the consequence. You wanted freedom, Tessa. Now you'll have to deal with it." Tessa's hands trembled as she reached for the doorframe, as if she could will the situation to change. "You're all against me," she spat, her eyes wild with the chaos that swirled inside her. "You think I don't have enough to deal with? I have kids. I'm working. Don't you see that?" The sheriff's deputy stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The choice is yours." Tessa flinched, her body recoiling as if the words stung her. But the fight in her didn't dissipate. It only sharpened. Ryan's voice, soft but certain, broke through the storm. "She didn't fail you," he said quietly, his gaze focused on Tessa's face, where anger and confusion met. "You failed her." Tessa whipped her head toward him, her face turning crimson. "You don't understand," she hissed, her breath shallow. "You're just like her." Ryan's gaze never faltered. "No, I understand better than you think. She tried, Mom. She always tried. It's you who didn't try hard enough. Joanne watched them both, her son and her daughter. Tessa's shoulders shook with emotion, but she made no move to leave. Her eyes were wide, searching for some excuse, some justification that would let her off the hook. But Joanne wasn't giving her any more excuses. Tessa had to face the consequences. The deputy took another step closer, his presence steady, reassuring. Tessa finally staggered back, tears streaming down her face, but the defiance still held. She turned, slamming the door behind her with a force that made the house shudder. Joanne exhaled slowly, watching the space where her daughter had stood just moments before. She could hear the angry footsteps fading into the distance, the door slamming one last time. Her chest tightened for just a moment, but then she felt it. The emptiness of the house, the weight of the decision she had made, lifting slightly with each passing second. She had done what needed to be done. For the first time, Tessa would truly have to stand on her own. The house was still. Joanne moved through it slowly, her footsteps muffled by the soft, well-worn carpet. The light from the late morning sun streamed through the windows, casting golden beams across the floor, illuminating every corner that had once felt so cluttered. The air smelled faintly of fresh pine and lavender, a lingering reminder of her quiet Saturday morning cleaning ritual, one she had rediscovered after so long. It had been days since Tessa had left. Days of silence that had initially felt foreign, but now, as she moved from room to room, it felt almost peaceful. The absence of Tessa's constant chatter, her bitter accusations, the weight of the unfinished business that had always hung between them, was finally gone. Joanne paused at the kitchen counter, her fingers brushing the edge of the smooth granite. She looked out the window to the garden that had become wild with the summer heat, the grass unkempt and thick with weeds. It hadn't mattered to her before, when she'd been scrambling to meet deadlines and keep Tessa's world in order. But now, in the quiet, she felt an unfamiliar calm. She could focus on things she had put aside for years. She took a deep breath, walking over to the sink. The sound of water running, the soft clink of dishes being put back into their places, was oddly comforting. There was no judgment now, no backtalk, no passive-aggressive comments from Tessa as she stood in the kitchen, watching her mother tidy up in silence. The light danced across the freshly polished surfaces, and Joanne allowed herself a moment to simply stand still, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a soft, reassuring blanket. She wasn't sure if Tessa would ever forgive her. Maybe she never would. But Joanne had done the right thing. She had given Tessa every chance to be the person she needed to be, and Tessa had chosen to remain stuck in her own excuses. Joanne's gaze lingered on the open window, the breeze brushing in, stirring the curtains just enough to remind her of the outside world. She could do this now, live for herself, on her own terms. She wasn't just maintaining a house. She was building her life anew. The constant burden had lifted. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke her reverie. Joanne turned her head, recognizing the familiar rumble of Ryan's car. He always seemed to know when she needed a little extra help, when the weight of the house felt a little too heavy. He had been visiting often, mowing the lawn, bringing over groceries with that quiet care he had learned from watching her for all these years. She heard his footsteps on the porch, the soft tap of his boots against the wooden steps, and then the doorbell rang. It was a sound she welcomed now. It was Ryan, here to make sure she was okay. Here to remind her that she wasn't truly alone, no matter how much she had wanted to believe she was. Joanne opened the door, and there he stood, a paper bag of groceries in his hands, his smile wide and easy, his eyes softer than they had been in a long time. "Hey, Grandma," he said, holding up the bag as if it were an offering. "Got your favorite?" She smiled, the corners of her lips lifting with the natural warmth that Ryan always seemed to draw out of her. "Thanks, Ryan." she said, stepping aside to let him in. He was growing up so fast. It seemed like just yesterday that he was a little boy running through the house with energy she could barely keep up with. Now, he was the one bringing the groceries, taking care of things she hadn't had the energy for. He set the bag down on the kitchen counter, glancing around with a quick scan of approval. "Looks good in here," he said, taking in the freshly cleaned space, the bright light streaming in from the windows. "Everything's different." Joanne chuckled softly, reaching for a loaf of bread from the bag. "Different can be good," she said, placing the bread next to the fruit bowl. "I've needed this space, this quiet." Ryan nodded, his expression softening. He seemed to understand in a way that Tessa never could. Ryan didn't need to be told how hard it had been for Joanne, how much she had carried alone. He knew. "You're looking better," he remarked, his voice gentle but knowing. "You look lighter." Joanne paused, a soft laugh escaping her. "Lighter," she echoed, the word feeling unfamiliar but right. She hadn't realized just how much weight she'd been carrying, not until it was gone. "I think I'm finally breathing again, Ryan." He smiled at her, but there was something else in his eyes now, a quiet, unspoken pride. "You deserve it." She placed the bread in the pantry, then reached for a couple of tomatoes and onions. "I'm glad you're here," she said, keeping her back to him as she chopped the vegetables, her movements slow and deliberate. It felt good to be doing something small, something for herself, something for them. Ryan moved to the back door, pausing at the threshold. He glanced out at the overgrown garden, his lips pressed together in thought. "I'll mow the lawn," he said after a beat. "I know you've been meaning to get to it." Joanne didn't turn to look at him, but she nodded. "I'd appreciate that. I think the flowers will look nice this year, too." Ryan lingered in the doorway, his fingers tapping the frame. "Want help carrying those?" he asked, referring to the bags Joanne had brought in earlier. Joanne smiled, her eyes warm with something close to gratitude. "Not anymore." The words felt simple, but there was so much more to them. Not anymore. It wasn't just the groceries. It wasn't just the lawn. It was everything that had shifted in the space between them. Everything that had changed, that had finally settled. She didn't need to carry the weight anymore, and she didn't need to help Tessa anymore, either. Ryan raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of amusement and understanding. "I'll take care of it," he said, the words carrying the weight of a promise. Joanne looked out at the garden again, feeling that sense of peace settle deeper into her chest. It was time to move forward. "Thanks, Ryan," she said, her voice soft but full of something profound. He smiled back, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door gently behind him. Joanne stood for a moment, letting the silence fill the room. The house was quieter than it had ever been, and yet, for the first time in so long, it felt like home. The quiet of the house seemed to amplify as Joanne sat at the kitchen table, the heavy weight of the task before her pressing down on her chest. It was a simple thing, in theory, just a matter of signing a few papers. But in the quiet solitude of the morning, it felt monumental. The decision had been made long ago, but today was the day it would be finalized. The inheritance, the future, everything she had spent a lifetime building was about to change. The pen in her hand felt cold, foreign almost, as if it held the power to erase everything that had come before. Joanne exhaled slowly, smoothing the paper before her. She'd had this will for years, but now, the need to rewrite it had become as inevitable as everything else she had done in the past few months. She began by drawing a neat line through Tessa's name, an action that was both liberating and painful. The girl who had once been her whole world, the one who had been the reason for so many sacrifices, was no longer entitled to what Joanne had worked for. Tessa had been removed from every contingency. The inheritance that had once been promised to her was now Ryan's to receive. Joanne's hand didn't waver as she wrote Ryan's name across the page. Her gaze was steady, but there was something bittersweet about it. It wasn't the decision she had hoped to make when she had first held her daughter in her arms, but Tessa had made her choices. And Joanne had finally come to terms with the fact that her daughter would have to face the consequences of those choices. She added a clause, one she had considered carefully over the last few days, a clause that was simple, but vital. The recipient of this inheritance must maintain a standard of respect for others and honor the legacy of responsibility and hard work. Joanne set the pen down for a moment, looking at the words she had written. They felt like a seal, a promise to herself that she would no longer be manipulated or taken for granted. She had carried the weight of others for so long, and now she was building a future that she could truly claim as her own. With a quiet sigh, she folded the document neatly and placed it in the folder in front of her. Her fingers traced the edges for a moment, the weight of it grounding her in the stillness. She had done what needed to be done. The drive to Mira's office was smooth, the sun casting a warm glow on the streets as Joanne navigated the familiar route. She had made the decision, and now it was time to make it official. As much as the act of rewriting her will had felt like a personal victory, she knew it wasn't complete until Mira had notarized it, until the documents were safely placed away. Mira was waiting for her when she arrived, standing behind her desk with a quiet smile. The office, always so precise and orderly, felt reassuring to Joanne. Everything in its place, no questions asked. Mira had been her confidant through the years, helping her navigate legal matters with a calm efficiency that had always made Joanne feel like everything was going to be okay. "Everything in order?" Mira asked, her tone steady as always. Joanne nodded, handing over the will. "It's all done. Tessa's been removed from everything. Ryan gets it all now." Mira glanced over the document, her eyes flicking across the clauses Joanne had added. "It's final then," she said quietly, but with a note of satisfaction in her voice. "There's no going back now." "No going back?" Joanne echoed, her voice steady but with a finality that she hadn't expected. It felt like a door closing, a chapter ending, but she was at peace with it. Mira took the pen and affixed her signature with precision, then placed the document in the safe. She looked up at Joanne, her expression both professional and warm. "I'll keep a copy on file for you as well, just in case." Joanne nodded, appreciating the practicality of Mira's foresight. She trusted her completely. Mira had always been more than just a legal advisor. She was the one who had helped her through the darkest parts of her life, the one who had shown her that it was okay to let go. As Mira locked the safe and handed her a second notarized copy, Joanne took a deep breath. "This time," she said softly, "no one rewrites me." Mira's gaze softened, understanding the weight of the words. "You've earned that, Joanne." Joanne stood there for a moment, the finality of the action sinking in. The world outside the office was busy, people rushing to their meetings, cars honking in the distance. But in that moment, Joanne felt a deep sense of calm. The house was quieter now. Tessa was gone. Ryan would be fine. And for the first time in a long while, Joanne was doing what was right for herself. Back at home, Joanne placed the will in a safe spot, away from prying eyes, knowing it was where it needed to be. She sat at the kitchen table once more, the weight of the morning's task settling into her bones. For the first time, she wasn't doing this for anyone else. She wasn't fixing things, carrying burdens, or making excuses. She was simply living. Joanne's phone buzzed again, a message from Ryan. "Mowed the lawn, Grandma. Also, I was thinking we should fix that back fence next weekend." Joanne smiled as she read it, the warmth of Ryan's care filling the empty spaces Tessa had left behind. She typed back quickly, "Sounds good. Let's do it. She set the phone down, her gaze lingering on the window, the garden outside, and the world beyond. It was her turn now. To live without guilt. To stand tall. And this time, no one would rewrite her story. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the sound slicing through the quiet of the afternoon. Joanne didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. She'd known this moment would come. Tessa had been silent for days, and in that silence Joanne had felt the sting of everything unsaid, everything unresolved. But now, the message had arrived. Joanne picked up the phone slowly, her fingers grazing the screen, and clicked on the voicemail. She pressed it to her ear, the distant hum of the world outside stilling as she listened. Tessa's voice came through, shaky but thick with something else. Resentment, frustration, maybe guilt. "Mom," she said, her tone low, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure how to start or where to go. I know things got out of hand. I'm sorry. I need you to understand. I'm struggling. I need help. I don't know what else to do, but I can't keep living like this." Joanne closed her eyes for a moment, the words washing over her, but not in the way Tessa had hoped. It was the same cycle: guilt, blame, and now, a thin thread of an apology, a hollow one. She had heard it all before. The phone in her hand felt heavier now. The urge to call Tessa back, to fix things, to somehow make her understand, tugged at her. But it was fleeting, vanishing like a vapor. The truth had already been spoken in the stillness of the past few weeks. There was nothing left to say. Without a second thought, Joanne pressed the delete button. The voicemail was gone. Just a whisper. A fleeting echo that no longer mattered. She wouldn't replay it. There was nothing left in it but words that were too late. Ryan, having walked into the room, stopped at the sight of his grandmother standing still, her gaze now fixed on the screen. His voice was low but clear, the concern in it gentle. "Still no apology?" he asked, his eyes not quite meeting hers, knowing full well the weight of the question. Joanne exhaled a slow breath, keeping her gaze on the phone in her hand. The space between them was thick, but there was no need for pretense anymore. "That would require humility," she said, her voice steady. Yet the weight of the truth was evident in the calmness of her words. Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Recognition. "You did what you had to do," he said, the quiet pride in his voice unmistakable. Joanne didn't answer at first. She turned away, setting the phone down on the table with a deliberate finality. The weight of her decision still sat with her, though the heaviness had lightened over time. The door that Tessa had walked through was now firmly closed. The phone buzzed again, but Joanne didn't reach for it. She knew it would be Tessa. Probably another call, another message, maybe even another apology. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Joanne stood up and walked over to the computer, her fingers moving over the keyboard with practiced precision. She opened her email to the bank's secure site. As she navigated through the system, her mind was focused on one final act, one last step in severing all that tied her to Tessa. She was done being the safety net, the one who carried everything. She entered the necessary details and pulled up the emergency contacts section. With one quick, deliberate motion, she removed Tessa's name from the list, leaving only Ryan's as the sole contact. She clicked Save without hesitation. There was a sense of finality in the action, but also a quiet peace. Joanne closed the laptop with a soft click, the finality of it settling in her chest. She stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the desk, her mind momentarily lost in thought. Ryan watched her for a moment longer, his gaze soft but steady. "You did the right thing, Grandma," he said quietly, his voice full of that same understanding that had carried them both through the storm. Joanne didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch for a moment, her mind still processing everything: the loss, the choices, the future. But then she turned toward Ryan, meeting his eyes for the first time with a softness that only he could see. "It wasn't about doing the right thing," she said, her voice thick with meaning. "It was about doing what was necessary." Ryan's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, his eyes proud, though a little sad. "I know, Grandma. I know." Joanne walked toward the window, her gaze lingering on the garden outside. The sunlight flickered across the grass, but it no longer felt like a burden. She had done what she needed to do. The world outside continued as it always had, but for Joanne, the weight had finally been lifted. Tessa was gone, not physically, but emotionally, and Joanne was no longer trapped in the cycle of giving. She had given enough. And as she looked out over the quiet yard, Joanne knew that finally, for the first time in years, she was free. The house was quiet as Joanne sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paperwork in front of her. It was one of the things she had been avoiding for months. Now, there was no reason to wait any longer. Ryan had been a rock through everything, through Tessa's defiance, through the storm of resentment and bitterness that had poisoned their lives for so long. It was time for Joanne to give something back. But this time, it wasn't out of obligation. It wasn't out of guilt. It was because she wanted to. Because Ryan deserved it. Her fingers traced the edges of the form as she filled in the necessary details. Ryan's full name, his social security number, and the instructions to the college fund that would be set up for him. She'd saved this money for years, squirreling it away when she could, working extra hours when the chance arose. It had always been for Tessa, of course, but now it was for Ryan. She wrote the final number in the tuition section and then hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Paying for a child's education was never easy, but this was more than just money. It was a chance to help Ryan build his future, one that was finally his to claim. Joanne clicked the submit button. It was done. The weight of it lifted from her shoulders in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the money. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last act of love that didn't come with strings attached. She wasn't saving Ryan anymore. She wasn't fixing everything for him. She was helping him stand on his own, and that felt like the right thing to do. Later that week, Ryan came into the kitchen, his eyes bright with excitement, but there was something else there too: confusion. "Grandma, I need to talk to you," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. Joanne turned, her hands busy chopping vegetables. "What's on your mind?" she asked. The question simple enough, but she already had an inkling of what was coming. Ryan held up an envelope, the college fund statement in his hand. I don't understand. The money? It says my tuition's already been paid in full." He glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Did you do this? You paid for everything up front?" Joanne set the knife down and faced him, a soft smile on her lips. "I did," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of something deeper. "I didn't want you worrying about it. You have enough on your plate." Ryan shook his head, still not fully comprehending. "You didn't have to do that, Grandma. It's a lot of money, and I didn't even ask. I mean, I'm not even sure how to—" Joanne raised a hand gently, cutting him off. "That's what gratitude sounds like, Ryan. You don't need to ask for help if you deserve it. I wanted to do this for you." He stared at her for a long moment, his lips slightly parted, trying to find the right words. But they never came. Instead, he pulled her into a tight hug, his arms around her in a way that made Joanne's heart swell. It wasn't just the gesture. It was the understanding between them. Ryan didn't need to say it. She could feel it in the hug. The silent thank you, the acceptance, the love that passed between them. Later that afternoon, they went to the grocery store together, just like they always did. Ryan pushed the cart, his usual enthusiasm slightly dimmed by the morning's revelation, but he carried every bag with a quiet determination. Joanne let him. At the checkout, he moved with ease, making sure everything was packed neatly, carrying the bags out to the car without a word. They had always shared these moments, the mundane, the necessary, but today, there was something different about it. Something simple, yet profound. Joanne watched as he opened the trunk and began placing the bags inside. She felt a tug at her heart, a deep sense of pride and affection for him. She had done right by him. He wasn't like Tessa. He understood. He was learning how to stand on his own, but he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders like she had. Ryan closed the trunk and turned to face her. "Want help carrying those?" he asked with a slight grin, as if the question had just popped into his head. Joanne smiled, a warmth filling her chest. She looked at him, her heart light, for the first time in so long. "Not anymore," she said, her voice steady, but with a subtle softness that only he could hear. Ryan's smile deepened and he nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I got it, Grandma." She watched as he climbed into the car, his hands firmly gripping the wheel. The world outside was brighter, clearer now. The weight had shifted. Tessa was no longer the center of her life. She had done what she could for her, but now it was Ryan who filled that space. And Ryan, for the first time, was learning how to carry his own weight, without fear or hesitation. Joanne took a breath, her hand resting on the armrest as the car pulled onto the road. She wasn't worried anymore. She had done the right thing, and now she could finally breathe easy. The road ahead was theirs to take, together. The future had finally arrived. The deed was the last piece of the puzzle, the final affirmation of everything Joanne had fought for, everything she had worked so hard to build. As she looked down at the document resting in front of her, the weight of it settled into her chest. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the culmination of a lifetime's work. It was everything that had once been hers, now truly secured, now finally defended. She took the frame out of the cabinet and set it carefully on the table. A simple brass plaque was attached to the front. The words engraved on it were plain, but they held the kind of weight that only years of sacrifice and hard work could bring. Owned, earned, defended. Joanne traced the letters slowly, her fingers brushing the metal with a reverence that only she could understand. The deed itself had been signed, finalized, and placed in the safe, but this would be the lasting symbol of the decision she had made. It was for her, for Ryan, and for herself. Ryan walked into the room just as Joanne placed the deed inside the frame. He looked at her with a question in his eyes, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had been with her through every step of this, had watched her struggle, had seen the toll that years of self-sacrifice had taken. "I'm not carrying the weight anymore," Joanne said, her voice soft but filled with resolve. Ryan nodded, his eyes steady as he took in the sight of the framed document. He knew exactly what it meant. "Want me to hang it?" he asked, his voice steady but full of the pride he had always carried for her. Joanne smiled, the first genuine smile she had given in months. "Yes, please," she said, stepping aside to give him room. "It's time." Ryan moved to the wall, the frame in his hands as he adjusted it, making sure it hung straight. He took a step back, his eyes flicking to the plaque once more. The words glistened under the soft light of the afternoon. "You've earned this," he said quietly, a soft reverence in his voice as he stepped back and gave Joanne a final nod of approval. The sound of the doorbell rang, a momentary interruption to the calm. Joanne turned toward the door, feeling a flicker of hesitation, an old habit, a desire to run back to the chaos she had finally shed. But she didn't need to anymore. She opened the door and was met with the quiet of the outside world, the garden just beginning to show signs of life. There was no Tessa waiting on the other side, no angry confrontation, no words of blame or guilt. It had been weeks since she had last seen her daughter, and there had been no further calls, no further attempts at reconciliation. Tessa had been absent in more ways than one, and Joanne had come to realize that maybe, for the first time, it was Tessa's silence that had finally spoken volumes. The house had grown quieter, but in that quiet, Joanne felt something she had never thought she would feel: peace. She walked down the garden path, the soil still soft from the morning dew. The flowers, once neglected, were beginning to bloom again. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the grass as she made her way to the back door. She carried the groceries in one arm, one full bag, heavy with the week's necessities, and the keys to the house in her other hand. She paused for just a moment, the world around her still, the quiet of the evening settling over her like a blanket. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't waiting for someone else to ask for help, or to demand that she fix things. She wasn't looking over her shoulder to see if anyone was watching, anyone needed something from her. It was just her. And it was enough. She reached the back door and paused for a moment, her hand resting on the handle. The garden around her, the path she had walked 100 times before, felt new in this moment. It wasn't the weight of the past that had shaped this place anymore. It was the future. Hers and Ryan's. The future was hers to shape now. Joanne walked inside, setting the groceries down on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, but it was different now. It was calm. She had earned this peace, this space to finally live. She walked back to the living room, where the framed deed now hung prominently on the wall. She looked at it for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the frame. There was no turning back now. And for the first time in so long, she didn't need to. The last line of the day, the one that had been written 100 times in her head, finally slipped into the quiet. She whispered it softly, almost to herself. My daughter laughed when I struggled with the groceries, so I let her struggle with the bills. She stood there, in the silence of her home, the truth of those words settling into her bones. Tessa had laughed. But now it was time for Tessa to see just how heavy her own burdens could be. The weight had shifted, and Joanne was finally free.